Hi, this is Megan Davies of the South American Tourism Office. I'm just going to give you a short presentation introducing you to the geography of South America and also tell you a bit about the history of the people that make up South America. This map shows you the size of the South American continent in comparison to Australia. Australia's landmass actually is smaller than Brazil's. So we know that you need at least 2 weeks to fly around Australia to see most of the major sites. So we would recommend you need at least 3 weeks flying around South America to see most of the iconic and well-known sites it has to offer. The quickest way to get to South America is on a direct flight, 12 hours flying time from Sydney, Australia to Santiago in Chile. So looking at the continent as a whole, the Andes Mountains run right down the west coast. They run for over 7,000 kilometres, the highest point being Aconcagua Mountain, which is on the border of Argentina and Chile. And then we have the Amazon River and the basin, which is in the northern half of Brazil, but the source actually starts in Peru, and the river runs for over 6,000 kilometres to its mouth, and the mouth of the Amazon is estimated to be about 300 kilometres wide. It is actually fed by 1,000 tributaries that come as far north from places like Guyana and Suriname, from Ecuador, Peru and Bolivia. Patagonia in the south is actually an area of Argentina and Chile, and on the Chilean side it's considered very much to be like Alaska, lots of fjords and glaciers and mountain ranges, where the Argentinian side runs from a very flat plateau from the Atlantic coast right through to the Andes Mountains and all the way down to Ushuaia in the south. The Galapagos Islands lie 1,000 kilometres off the coast of Ecuador, and if you're travelling out there to do a small ship cruise or island hopping, you need to fly from either Quito or Guayaquil out to the Galapagos. Easter Island is a part of Chile, and it's about 2,000 kilometres off the coast of Chile and can be a stopover to or from Australia. The Darien Gap, which is a landmass found in southern Panama, is right on the border of Colombia, and you can't travel overland between those two countries. You either have to fly or there are some ferry services. Just having a closer look at the Amazon basin and the west coast, Manaus is the largest port on the Amazon. The Amazon is actually 24 kilometres wide during the dry and can reach nearly 200 kilometres wide during the wet. So for your jungle and Amazon experience, you actually travel out of Manaus by boat, or you can go into the upper reaches and stay in some lodges. Manaus itself is a really interesting city, but if you don't have the time to go all the way out to Manaus, you can also visit Amazon camps in Ecuador, Peru and in Bolivia. And some of the tributaries are so wide there's also cruising offered through those jungle regions as well. If you look at the Andes Mountains that are running right down that west coast, there are a number of towns, Quito in Ecuador, Cusco in Peru and La Paz in Bolivia, that are over 10,000 feet. So over 10,000 feet there is a lack of oxygen, and so some people do experience a little bit of altitude sickness. So we design an itinerary to minimise the effect of that on you, and so you can maximise the good time you have in those areas. Now just looking at some of those regions in southern South America, the Atacama Desert, which is actually in Chile, is also at fairly high altitude and is one of the driest deserts in the world. In fact, a lot of it doesn't receive any rain whatsoever. Iguazu Falls, which lies on the border of Brazil and Argentina, is over 2.5 kilometres wide and has over 270 cascading falls falling through a tropical forest. It's often used as a stopover when you're travelling between Santiago and Rio, or Buenos Aires and Rio. And now there's actually a direct flight from Lima to Iguazu. Down in the south, the Chilean coastline is about 1,600 kilometres of very remote and wild terrain. The Andes Mountains are spectacular, with a lot of rock towers and fjords and wild forests and very secluded villages. We run a number of small ship cruising down the coastline, and also there's great national parks like the Torres del Paine and Terra del Fuego National Park to visit, and a lot of opportunities for hiking as well. Ushuaia is actually on the Argentinian side, and this main port is also the jumping off point for a lot of the cruises that go down to Antarctica. It's actually about a 48-hour timeline to get to King George Island in the north of Antarctica. Or these days you can actually fly from a small town in southern Chile, Punta Arenas, and it's about a 2.5-hour flight down to Antarctica. Now I just want to talk about a little bit about the different peoples that make up South America and the different migrations, what makes it such an interesting continent to travel around. As you can see, there's a line under Rio and right across South America. Nearly everyone below that line is about 90% of them are European extraction, where north of that line you'll find most of them are indigenous or African Brazilian. So there's quite a big definition between the south and the north. But first of all, the indigenous people that settled in South America originally came from Asia and crossed the Bering Strait and left all their cousins in North and Central America. And there are some theories that they also came across from the Polynesian islands. Anyway, they were left on their own for thousands of years until 1492, when Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue and arrived in the Caribbean. And it wasn't long after that until the Europeans arrived in mass. The Portuguese settled the Brazilian side of South America in early 1500s, closely followed by the Spanish, who were actually trying to settle on the coast of Argentina, but actually made their capital in Lima in Peru. They finally settled Buenos Aires in the late 1800s, and they initially utilised a lot of the indigenous people to work on their plantations and to build infrastructure and etc. But the Catholic Church in the end put a stop to it, saying that they were being treated badly and as slaves, and this wasn't considered the right thing to do. But in fact, they endorsed the Portuguese and the Spanish going to Africa to actually get their slaves from there. Over time, they actually brought in 4.5 million African slaves into South and Central America, and that was more than went to the North America over time. In 1880, slavery was abolished and a lot more Europeans started moving to South America, particularly from Portugal and Spain and Italy, and more Europeans arrived here in big numbers after the First World War and also the Second World War. The Welsh also discovered southern Patagonia in the 1860s. They thought they were starting a new Welsh country down there, and at the peak of it there was 25,000 Welsh people living in the town of El Calafate in Patagonia. At one stage, the Brazilians thought that they'd like to encourage their migration, and they particularly were looking for European migration, but at the same time they attracted a lot of Japanese to Brazil. Japan had just, the feudal system had collapsed, and a lot of the Japanese were looking for new opportunities, and they not only came to Brazil, but they also came to Peru. But today, Brazil actually has the second highest Japanese population anywhere in the world. Also, in the early 1900s, quite a lot of Chinese arrived in South America. Some came earlier and the Portuguese brought them in, but more numbers came from Hong Kong and Taiwan in the early 1900s, and some Christian Arabs also moved to Mexico and into Brazil before the First World War. The British actually didn't have much influence in South America. Over time, they actually had a bit of influence in the Caribbean, and they also had British Guiana in the north, but they had more influence in South America after Chile and Bolivia and Brazil trying to get their independence from Portugal and Spain, and so they were much more influential at that time, providing military help and the building of infrastructure, and in fact part of setting up their political systems. Probably the most unknown one is that there was an immigration from Australia too. In the 1893, the Australian Labor Party had a disagreement, and the socialist side of the Labor Party took their own chips to Uruguay and eventually settled in Paraguay. And they say today that there's probably about 2,000 descendants of those original Australians who settled there in the late 1800s. So I think what this represents to me is that what an interesting destination it is for all the mix of people, and it's probably created that great blend of cultures and definitely the best looking people in the world. But what I find when I'm travelling there, that no one's really identified by race. They're definitely patriotic for their countries, particularly with sport, but it is really a really nice mix of people represented from all over the world. Anyway, so thank you for listening to me. I hope you find some of those points interesting, and of course when you're planning your trip to South America, we're specialised in tailor-made but also offer group tours as well. But yeah, talk to us, the locals. We'd love to help you. Thank you.